What bugs me about the term data driven is the driven. The implication that you're not making the choice, the data is making choices for you.
Now, one way I have done this in marketing is to think of what we do in marketing as a minor league, major league kind of an environment.
From Orion X, this is the Marketing Podcast. Marketing has transformed in significant ways. More technology, more data, more social, more blending of arts and sciences, more integrated with every other function, and ultimately more critical to the organization. Join Shaheen Khan and Doug Garnett as they discuss news and happenings in the world of marketing, from the boardroom to customer programs.
Hi, everybody. Marketing Podcast once more. This is Shaheen Khan with Doug Garnett. How are you, Doug?
I'm great, Shaheen.
All right. We were talking about a bunch of really interesting topics, to us anyway, and hopefully to the listeners. Let's start with the first one, and that's none other than the celebrity of our time, Elon Musk.
Elon Musk is always good for some discussion, but the today and yesterday, what's been going crazy is this whole cache of text messages and Twitter messages that went around between Elon and his connections. People like Andreessen, there are various people of power around the tech business. And it's actually been kind of funny to watch the commentary because everybody's got something to say because it's Elon Musk, Mr. Lightning Rod, and he draws all the attention. But I think we ought to talk about him a bit because I think there's a couple good things to learn. But first, tell us, what was your thought about the messages?
Yeah, so the Atlantic article is what instigated my reading it. And these text messages were presumably meant to be private. I don't know how they came to be. I think it was part of a discovery in the court case. But you get a glimpse of his commentary, not in his capacity as a celebrity who is actively working to retain that celebrity status, but private conversations with other peers, so to say, because they're all, as you mentioned, people of note in the tech industry.
Mm-hmm.
So that part was interesting because now you get a glimpse into how private conversations happen among these guys.
Well, I think too, the thought that occurs to me there is that, by seeing those, we begin to see what they used to call how the sausage is made. That was always used with politics, which is you really didn't necessarily want to know how the deal got done in the back room. You just want to know, here's the law that got to there. Because the reality of how things happen in the world is not like TV. It just isn't the latest hot show on Netflix or Amazon Prime or wherever. You know, we're all human beings. So I think partly it reveals that despite his celebrity, Elon Musk is still just a guy. And his conversations with his friends are actually kind of dull. And, maybe, interesting to him, but as an outsider, yeah, it is as an outsider when you go listen to somebody else's conversation and think, wow, where's the
Right.
excitement in that? Because, like two other people, they share a whole bunch of stuff and they can have a really mundane sounding discussion that to them is really valuable. And the rest of us are like, oh, yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's an intrigue in eavesdropping on
Yeah.
some powerful people's conversations and say, that's the kind of stuff that they talk about. But
Mhm.
what we never know when you eavesdrop is you never know the intent of the person.
Mhm.
You never know whether they're saying this because they have something else in mind. They
Mhm.
may say this without believing it because that's the game they want to play. We don't really get those pieces of data. So we have to recognize that. But you nevertheless do get the feeling that you're in on something that you normally aren't in on, and that's intriguing and interesting.
It is. Then I thought the Atlantic article, one of the interesting things in it was it talked about how, despite these people being powerful people, when it comes to their dealing with Elon Musk, they were all a little sycophantic. They're all making up to him because he's the big guy. He's the guy that's the richest man in the world, or whatever.
Well, it was not a complimentary article,
No,
not about him nor some of the other folks who were there. And again, I don't know whether they said whatever they said for effect or they really meant it.
hmm
But the context of it, of course, was this big, 40+ billion-dollar deal that he's trying to spearhead. And if you want in on that, then you want in on that. He's the guy
yeah.
who's got the ball right now.
hmm
And it's interesting to see these guys' capacity to recognize that and say
hmm
that he's got the ball. So in this particular case, he's the boss, and we better if I want in on this, I need to support him and I need to come across like that. That was my read.
Well, I thought I had a couple other thoughts that came out of it, and one was we'll start with not the one we talked about as much in the pre-show, but um, what occurs to me. One of the things that occurred to me in reading these comments is maybe Twitter's already awfully damn good, and that it's not a simple thing to wave a magic wand and all of a sudden have everybody be entirely happy with with how it works. And I've said from the beginning on this deal with Elon Musk that he's not prepared for that. I don't think that interpersonal communication is his primary strength. I think that he is brilliant in so many ways, but I don't think that this is where his strengths are going to play well for him. And maybe Twitter already works pretty well. Dollar Shave told us that they could reinvent the razor industry, and it turned out they got bought by a razor company, by Unilever, to be their razor company, and Unilever can't figure out how to make money with them because they were basically giving away razors, and that's how they got big, was by giving away their goods. The razor market, it turns out, was already pretty economically efficient. Room for change always, but pretty economically efficient.
Yeah,
I think that we may discover that Twitter's already in that spot.
well, I think in general it is easy to judge things from far away
Hmm.
and say, and this is kind of a segue into my complaint about the marketing profession, that
Hmm.
a lot of the commentary I see on social media is all about why other people are doing it wrong and how dumb can you get. And
Hmm.
so it's easy to judge things from far away, and you see some of that in these text messages. But then as you get closer to it, you realize that people thought about a lot of those things already. It's
Hmm.
not a new idea. They
Hmm.
probably try to implement the good ones and they hit obstacles that you can't think of.
Yeah.
And if you actually look at some of the other comments that these guys make about other things, oftentimes they do get to that point. It's like, let's do it, let's not do it. Oh, it cannot work, you
Hmm.
know. So
Hmm.
they go through the same process. It's just that because of their celebrity status, they get echoed in a way that amplifies their voice, including their wrong voice.
It reminds me of I once read a book by Peggy Noonan, who was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan.
Yeah,
And politically, that's not where I hang out. But on the other hand, the book was really interesting. And I thought the most fascinating part was she talked about arriving in the White House after Reagan was first elected, and how they all walked around, all the staff walked around looking at the ceilings and walls and going, wow, we're in the White House. And then they entered a second phase, which is, we're the leaders of the free world, and feeling confident and strong, and then the reality begins to hit. And the third phase for her was to begin looking around, going, "Oh no, these are the people who are the leaders of the free world." Because everybody's strengths and weaknesses start to show, and you see somebody who doesn't think too clearly, but maybe gets some success over there and the like. And what she never reported in the book, and I don't know if she ever got there or not, that a friend of mine observed, is the fourth phase is simply going, you know what? The leaders of the free world are just human beings. And I feel a little bit like that's what this shows. It's okay. So here's Elon Musk, this celebrity. You know
yeah.
what? Underneath it all, he's just a human being, and he has as many bad ideas as good ideas.
But there's a presumption that by the time you get to that state, you
Yeah,
have passed through many filters.
right.
I remember in the old days,
Hmm.
if you were at a company like IBM
Yeah.
that had a management discipline,
Hmm.
by the time you were like a second line or a third line manager, you were pretty good. You wouldn't make it up there if you were not pretty good.
Yeah.
So you have this expectation. You expect that if you make it to something like a world leader status or if you make it to a big corporation boss status, that you will have passed through a lot of these filters. So I think it is reasonable to expect that you're not just another guy, that
Mhm.
you have some exceptional qualities. And if those exceptional qualities are coming in, then really my commentary is that if you lucked into it, yeah, maybe you're just another guy.
Yeah. Well, I think there's that. Or if you're outside of your area of expertise, You're just another guy, and I think that may be some of what we're seeing here, which is here are all these guys who really, so many of them are financiers, and they didn't make it because they really know how to run these companies. They made it because they supply money. And so they
Right.
throw ideas around, but then they're all, it's Elon Musk who would have to at least figure out how to hire people who would have the ideas to run the company. So most of them are just throwing shit against the wall, and the wall being Elon Musk. And I think you're right. The other thing is that what we're seeing here is this is business at work. This is not really friends. This is
Hmm.
business at work. I
Hmm.
mean, what do we want though from a leader? And this goes everywhere across, whether it's in marketing
Right.
or a CEO or a president. Well, we want a leader who eventually arrives at the right choice.
Hmm.
And I mentioned that I do have some problems with some of the laws that make every action of government available for public critique. Because my experience of doing great things is you got to sit around in some meetings and say some really dumb shit before you
For
get to
sure.
that
For sure.
idea that you can eventually, because it's your choice in the end that matters, not what you said along the way to get there.
Yeah,
It's
that's right.
did you
That's right.
find the right answer in the end?
Yeah. So let's go to another controversy.
Good point.
And the next one has to do with how brands grow.
Yeah. Okay. So here it was. Twitter blew up this week with some criticism of Byron Sharp and the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, and what Byron Sharp has said in his book, How Brands Grow. And it primarily circled around an eternal discussion about differentiation. And Byron Sharp set the world afire a few years back by saying that he thought distinctive assets were more important than differentiation. And of course, for all of us who grew up on differentiation, that's such a radical thought. It's like, no, 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 no. I believe me, I had to do my own processing of it to kind of try to understand what he was saying and the like. And I don't entirely agree with him, but I think he's got a lot there. But as things go, his term is distinctive assets. Well, the assets get lost. And so the discussions around distinctiveness versus differentiation that hit the internet this week, and
Right.
oh, it went on and on and on and on and on and on. So that's the background. And you arrived on the scene.
Yes. So my joke, of course, was that the word distinctive is insufficiently distinctive and insufficiently differentiated.
Which is a fair point, ironically.
But kind of, getting past that being flippant, my interpretation, just so that it would make sense to me, was that it had to do with the kind of differentiation. I read the commentary as when you focus on your product differentiation, they better be indisputable. They better be black and white differentiation. I have it, you don't, game over. The problem is that that is not sustainable. You say that and it lasts for 2 days
Hmm.
before others claim to have it too, whether or not they have it.
Hmm. Yep.
So I always thought that distinctiveness was that kind of indisputable differentiation, that it
Hmm.
was the same spectrum. And if you wanted to stay in the indisputable corner, distinctiveness was a way of establishing that
Hmm.
you could control, and it wasn't something that others could copy and claim easily.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I fought this frustration in my agency because we were of the entire direct response television business. I think the one agency that was really solidly anchored in strategy and strategic work in reality. But there's no way to sell that because the minute you come out and say, well, we're the strategic, we have the strategy advantage, everybody else, you start reading other people's websites and you'd think that they were the gods of strategy, even though I knew the companies really well. And I knew that they were absolute bumbling, um, you know, klutzes with strategy. But you can't tell that to a client, well, they're all wrong and we're perfect. No, that doesn't work. Clients are smart enough to not buy that. So, I know that fight. I think some of the challenge here is back to this. I noted that Byron Sharp's comment is that distinctive assets are tremendously critical. And what he means there are those things that unequivocally recall
Stand
and
out.
bring people to your brand. But in other words, the Doritos package is a distinctive asset. And when you change your distinctive assets, you get into trouble because people can no longer, recognize your brand on the shelf. and things like that. And I think that if we keep it as distinctive assets, the discussion all of a sudden kind of settles out a little bit.
But it's hard to avoid
Yeah.
that the only way you make an asset distinctive is by focusing on distinctiveness, and
Yes.
so
Mhm.
it gets into the mix.
But wouldn't
Yeah,
you say though that if we just start with like the visual representations or sound the
sure,
representation
yes,
of your brand and your product, those
right,
do need to be distinctive, or else you get lost in the clutter.
right,
Um,
right.
but
You know,
how much does your product have to be distinctive or just well differentiated? And that, I think, is where for me that discussion is kind of the two levels of it.
yeah, another maybe not great analogy is in the parlance of software is user interface
Hmm.
versus the guts of a software package.
Yeah.
The user
Hmm.
interface is what can be distinctive, what you can get used to. And if they change it, you may not like the software anymore, even though it's really the same software.
Yes.
So the Doritos package really is the user interface of actual chips to
Hmm.
you as the consumer.
Hmm.
So that is an important way of presenting it.
Hmm.
So maybe that's another way of looking at it.
Actually, I don't. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one, because I think that is the truth, that when you look at the distinctive assets, their way of presenting and getting people to engage with the product or with you. If we switch it around to the B2B world that we've both been in, what's a distinctive asset in the B2B world? Some of it is your foundation story, although we found that foundation stories are about a quarter of an inch deep, so you get through it really quick, and then people say that's nice, but why should I care today? You do need clear names and logos and things like that. I think we fought that back in the day when Floating Point Systems decided to change its name to FPS Computing in order
Mm,
to reflect its change from Floating Point Systems, which were the floating point attached processors, into making big computers. And what I found is that was a very, very hard change. And people were, Floating Point Systems was a distinctive and clear name despite its liabilities. FPS computing sounded like went right past me.
yeah, it sure is, and it just shows how difficult it is to do it, and then
Yeah.
who are you doing it for, and whether customers. To me, this whole thing is the spectrum of differentiation. You're
Hmm.
talking about a difference between you
Hmm.
and others, and
Hmm.
that difference doesn't necessarily have to be a product difference.
Yeah.
We've talked about that in the past. It could
Yeah.
be a difference in any
Hmm.
aspect of your interaction with customers.
Hmm.
It really is all about the difference in customer experience in its totality. So it's the user interface, it's the actual product, it's the feature function, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's true, because I mean, differentiation. If you focus on and hire a certain kind of sales force, that can be a significant differentiation for your product and company, because the experience that people get with your sales force, if you're able to do that successfully, will set you apart. And
Yeah. So if you ask a consumer, why did you buy this? And you say, well, I like the package.
yeah.
Okay, that's a difference,
Hmm.
right? And they're not going to say that's because it's distinctive, even though it is not differentiated.
Yeah. Well, and I think, then we get into these issues of like, I don't want to ask my consumer about what, distinctive, because the distinctive assets, it really does come from a solid retail background, where, if you're walking down the aisle, you need to stand out on the shelf somehow.
Right.
And that's a different situation than if you're a business to business, selling of some $10 or $20,000 item.
Well, we need data to
Oh yeah.
analyze this further. And that's what
Well,
leads
I
us
think we
to,
should drive our decision with data, don't you think?
I think so. So let's talk about that.
Oh, I love this one. This discussion came back up. So Kinska Bureau put out a tweet, which I thought was a really good question. She says, "Can someone tell me, what does non-data driven decision making look like?" Essentially with the implication of, look, if you're not using some data somewhere, what the hell are you doing? And there were a number of responses that came back to it. But the thing that I thought was worth talking about is, what bugs me about the term data driven is the driven, the
Yes.
implication that you're not making the choice, the data is making choices for you. And I have seen bureaucracies where that idea is used to excuse all kinds of mistakes. I mean, you see people that say, well, but the data said to do it. And, that's not a legitimate management excuse. So as I read it, I'm like, the problem is, like, every decision needs to be data informed by whatever data we can get our hands on and use appropriately and process appropriately and understand. But I'd rather not be driving decisions with data. I'd rather be making my choices informed by data.
Yeah, no, I caught up after you explained it, and I agree. The word driven is too strong.
Yeah.
Um, and in fact, really, and you can tell that when you replace data with something else.
Yeah. Well, with all the stuff about emotional intelligence, maybe we should have emotion-driven decisions.
Exactly. So if you just replace the word data with other sort of driven, you will
Right.
soon find that no matter what you use, somebody's going to be like unhappy about it for good reason.
Mhm.
So, so my initial reaction was that this has a lot to do with where you're coming from. If you are coming from an environment where everybody just goes with gut feel and
Mhm.
data is abundantly available and routinely ignored, and it's
Mhm.
causing bad decisions, then it's I can see how you might say that, hey guys, we really need to be more data driven. Let's like look at the data we've got.
Mhm.
But then if you're coming from a background where you already are doing all of that that is necessary to incorporate data, then you recognize that data is a component of what goes into a decision, not
Mhm.
the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think that's for me, decision making comes down to this whole range of instinct and past experience and, data that's obtainable on the market and research that you go and work. It is interesting that, around market research, at one point I read an article that I haven't been able to get my hands on again. I don't know where it was, but I read an article that talked about how the value of market research depends on the company's executives and management staff and whether they know how to use it. And maybe that's the same is true with data, that it all depends on whether you know how to use it, not whether it exists. And, some people just don't know how to read data effectively in order to have it affect their decisions.
Yeah. So, as you know, one of my recent banners is data is hard even for you. Data is hard. And just because, it's just hard for everybody. So one thing is that everything is data. That's kind of
Yes.
one piece.
Yep. Hmm.
Uh, Second, commodity data, just the massive volume of nondescript data, doesn't have a lot of value.
Hmm.
Data needs to get transformed, manipulated. There's a data supply chain as commodity data translates into eventually valuable data. But it's data every step of the way. It's just that it's a
Right.
different kind of data.
Well, actually, with that, can I ask, isn't there also, this is where one of the risks comes up with data, which is as data gets transformed, it's a brilliant thing to do. But as the people who do that transformation leave the scene, you lose an understanding of what the transformation might have kept or lost. And so there's also a danger in transformation that somebody has to keep track of, oh, there was a transformation and here's what it meant. And therefore, this data can be used within these bounds, but don't try to use it for that decision.
Absolutely. I think the context of data and the definition of the data are also very, very difficult.
Mhm.
Within marketing, we can already talk about lead. I
Yeah,
got 5 leads. Okay, what do they mean?
right.
And what is a sales qualified lead? What is a marketing qualified lead? So before you know it, you've got a half a dozen different definition of lead. So it is very
Hmm.
simple to just lump them all together and say lead. So how much
Hmm.
granularity are you going to use to define these pieces of
Right.
data in a way that is tractable? But that makes any conversation difficult if you don't already agree on what it is you're talking about.
Hmm. I think I can make this make sense. I once worked on a thing around a campaign for Apple TV, or for Apple, not Apple TV, but a TV campaign for Apple. And we had done a half-hour infomercial, and a bunch of people had called. So this research firm went out and called those people back to ask some questions about interest and the like. And they reported back to us, and they said, "Wow, this is incredible. They were so much more interested than we find on average." And I said, "Well, what do you have on average?" Well, it turns out their average was people they had paid to come in and look at sitcoms in their facility. I'm like, okay, now wait a minute. You are trying to compare people who were interested enough by a TV ad to place a phone call and leave their name and number and their address against random people that you forced to watch a sitcom, and you're surprised that the people who showed all this motivation are more motivated than the people. It was a complete nonsense market research, and sad because they were a major market research firm nationally.
Yes.
And eventually, one of their guys that I worked with was the president of the Market Research Association, or the national group.
Yeah. Yeah.
What the heck?
I, I feel like we need a permanent section on this podcast on data because, as I keep saying, it doesn't go away. And
Yeah.
with digital getting bigger and bigger, data is just going to be a really big piece of this.
Hey,
Uh
so do you want to shift to a worst practice then? No, a best
huh.
practice. Actually, this is a best or worst practice question.
Best and worst practice.
All right. So an article is out today, and Rory Sutherland passed it along, and I went, "Oh, I have to look at this." And it suggested a really fascinating idea. And you know how in marketing, we follow what other people do in their marketing. And within an industry, it kind of becomes accepted practice that, well, if you're going to be in this industry, you use Google AdWords, and you use, paid banners, and you use, right, so forth and so on. And the article suggests that everybody should put aside 10% of their budget to spend on doing
Mm.
things that nobody else in the industry does. And I thought it's a fascinating idea. I don't know if 10% is right or wrong or indifferent, but the idea, we get so caught up in the idea that best practices will tell us all the answers.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to say, no, you really need to be changing things up.
Mm. So I have to tell a story that I have very often, and I never remember anymore whether I've said it even on this podcast before or not. But many years ago, when I was with the system company at Sun Micro, we were meeting with a Dutch bank, and I don't know which one it was. But the CIO was saying that I've got two parts to the bank: the part that runs the bank and the part that changes the bank. And I think that's what it reminds me of. Now,
Hmm.
within our own marketing group, and you would remember it from old times,
Yeah.
we had traditional sort of marketing activity that we did. The best part of it actually was in performance management and benchmarking.
Yep. Hmm.
You had industry standard benchmarking,
Hmm.
and then you had customer benchmarking.
Hmm.
And customer benchmarking was interrupt driven. They would come and go, and things would change because the situation would change.
Right.
Whereas industry standard benchmarking was like on a march, steady, etc. And after a while, we separated the teams that worked on those.
Hmm.
Because if we didn't, customer benchmarking would just occupy the whole thing.
Hmm.
That we needed to protect the part that was just trying to accomplish those other things.
Hmm.
And then in many IT environments where my background is, there is a production environment that you don't touch. That's like
Right.
the plane that is in flight and you don't mess with it. And then you need a lab environment where you can kick the tires and check out new technologies
Hmm.
such that you know what is eligible to get into the production environment.
Hmm.
So all of those kind of point to the same thing, is that
Yeah.
you've got to have the capability to do new things and evolve.
And I think it is particularly difficult in any environment that has some degree of bureaucracy in it, because at some point a bureaucracy becomes all about protecting its own job. And I don't mean that
Mm,
badly. I
mm.
don't mean it like these people set out to say, oh my God. But it's what happens among large groups of people that are all given rules about how to work and the like. And the truth is, if you're going to have a big operation, you've got to have people doing that. You kind of have to have people doing that bureaucratic stuff. And,
Yeah.
you have to have rules, you have to have methods, you have to have processes. But at the same time, the truth about organisms, and, this is all the stuff that comes out of complexity, is that, for example, if an ecosystem isn't challenged, it no longer has the health to survive for a long time. So that the more we try to control ecosystems as mankind, the
Mm, mm.
weaker we make those ecosystems. You just have
Right.
to have some natural challenges coming in. And so I love what you're talking about, because I think that's this thing about, you've got to be pushing the edge somewhere. You've got to be trying new things. You've got to have some people who are given the ability to say, don't care about what the best practices are. Just go do something. And it's interesting to me because, I work around a lot of people I consider quite innovative in both in business and in art and all these places. And what I found is the really brilliant people, um, they don't think about practices at all. They're focused on trying to find solutions. And it's kind of like what I've always felt is you need them turned loose to go find solutions. And once they find the solution, then you back up to figure out how to deal with the
Right.
problems.
Right.
But if you don't let them go to find solutions, you'll
Mhm,
never get to the
mhm,
solutions.
mhm. Now, one way I have done this in marketing is to think of what we do in marketing as a minor league, major league kind of an environment
Mhm,
where you introduce a campaign or an idea or a new marketing mix vehicle as an experiment
mhm,
in a limited way. That's
mhm,
like a test market that consumer guys do, and usually it's somewhere in Illinois, right? Uh,
mhm.
isn't it like Peoria, Illinois, is where all the test marketing
Yeah,
happened in the
yeah,
old
it
days?
was for a long time. Peoria was the standard. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of test drive it, and if it shows promise, you expand it. And
Hmm.
likewise, if you have a major campaign that is global and it's starting to lose steam, instead of just wiping it out, you can reduce its scope gradually
Hmm.
and let it all evolve like an organism. So the minor league, major league has really worked for me in
Hmm.
allowing new stuff to happen and evolve it in a proper way.
I think the only difficulty I've found, and I don't have a management solution to it at this point, is I've seen those situations where some of the people in the major league get so dismissive of what the minor leagues are exploring that they'll never, it's like an argument that turns out between them, right? And
Right.
sometimes there's a jealousy of the minor league people because they have freedom to play and innovate and do clever things. Sometimes there's it's some kind of a competition.
Yeah.
And when it
Yeah.
becomes a competition, that's bad. I think that, somehow, if it's got a rationale to it that everybody understands and accepts, it can be absolutely brilliant. And that's one
Yeah.
of the challenges that we have with it is to try to figure out how to manage it so that it doesn't become, you know.
Well, a big part of this, and this we may have to leave until a later episode, is the scale of things. This kind of stuff is easier in a big company where you've got a lot of voices and you can see
Mhm,
whether campaign works in this part of
mhm,
the world, but not that part of the world. And you've got enough people in the field to opine and help you steer it. If it's a smaller company, it's harder. And of course, even marketing as a whole has a
mhm,
different meaning as a small company
mhm.
than it does in a big company.
Absolutely, I think so. So we'll leave it there.
We'll leave it there. All right, so let's wrap up this episode. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Shahid.
Thank you to all of our listeners.
Absolutely.
Until next time,
All right.
take care.
Bye bye.
That's it for this episode of the Marketing Podcast. Every episode is posted on orionx.net and shared on social media. Use the comments section or tweet us with any questions or to propose topics. If you like the show, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. The Marketing Podcast is a production of Orion X. Thank you for listening.